There's a common misconception that the word thou was used as a formal way of saying you in Old and Middle English. While today, thou is an archaic term that you likely only encounter when studying older English texts, it was fairly common in Old and Middle English. Well, it's actually still used in some dialects of English in Northern England, but these remain exceptions. Let me emphasize again that thou was definitely not a respectful or fancy way of saying you. As a matter of fact, back then, you was the formal way to address someone while thou was the casual, informal, or intimate way to address someone. Let's understand the difference between the two, then we can look into why this misconception exists. So why did we have you versus thou, and what happened to thou? Back in Old English and Middle English, there was a difference between the second person singular, talking to one person, and the second person plural, talking to multiple people. Today we use you for both cases, whether talking directly to one or multiple people. In many dialects of English, mainly in North America, this distinction still exists with y'all, you all, or you guys. As such, in these dialects, you is singular, talking directly to one person, while y'all or you guys are plural, talking directly to multiple people. At the same time, in Old English and Middle English, there was a difference in how you would address someone when talking to them directly depending on your relation with them. In other words, if this person was intimate, like family, you'd address them differently as if they were your boss or in a position that incites a form of respect. For example, you can think of the local pastor or an important person in the city. This is where the distinction you versus thou appears. However, like I said before, thou is the informal singular pronoun, while you is used for either the plural or the formal way to address someone. Historically, you started as plural and then later on became a pronoun used in formal context. This distinction between formal versus informal pronouns was not unique to English. This is something you see in a lot of languages, even today. For example, tu versus vous in French, du versus si in German, tú versus usted in Spanish. Although Spanish follows a slightly different pattern, where the formal way to address someone refers to the third person and not the second. Besides, this is something you can also find in languages that have honorifics, where the distinction between formal and informal can have multiple levels. For example, in Japanese, you have various pronouns depending on the level of formality, going from very informal to very formal. People stopped using thou because you slowly became the way to address someone. As it's happening, thou became more and more seen as informal. I mean, that's what it always was, but this became more and more prominent. What's happening is that thou was seen more and more as being too informal or too casual, and not as an intimate way like before, leading it to ultimately disappear. After this explanation, you may wonder why this distinction disappeared in English, but stayed in other languages. Unfortunately, this question does not come with a satisfying answer. Languages change on a daily basis, and while some changes can also happen in the span of decades or centuries, it's sometimes hard to have satisfying answers about why some changes happen the way they do. While I just mentioned why people stopped using thou, when looking at other languages that kept this feature, it feels like something is missing. The reality is, languages change and simply reflect different cultures. A language change does not necessarily mean a change in society, but can also simply be a change in how something is represented. By nature, languages are in constant evolution. As such, some languages will keep some features, while others may abandon them, and maybe will get them back in the future. Does it mean that English speakers are less formal or rude compared to speakers of another language, or compared to centuries ago? Not really. This type of comparison does not make a lot of sense, as politeness goes beyond language or the use of one or multiple pronouns. In other words, there are other ways to signal formality in someone's speech rather than using different variations of you. Think of words like could or please that can be applied to show a form of formality. On top of that, formality can be signaled outside of linguistic characteristics. For example, dressing differently depending on the context, depending on the type of work you're doing, or being at work versus at home. Bringing a gift when being invited somewhere. These are just simple examples, and I'm sure you can think of various other ways. Finally, let's look at why there is a misconception about thou today. Like we saw throughout this video, you was actually the formal way to address someone. Today it's both, or neither. What we see here is one word that persisted and stayed present in the language, you. People are also aware that there's a distinction between you and thou in terms of formality. The fact that there's only one pronoun now is enough for people to understand that the level of formality changed to being less formal, you being one trait that fits all. As such, it is common to believe that because thou disappeared and that English pronouns are less formal than before, then thou was the formal pronoun. And this logic could be right, as the results are the same today, only you is used. So we saw the historic reasons were slightly different, but ultimately the outcome is the same.